It's the TMZ Behind the Bar podcast with the TMZ lawyers, Jason Beckerman and Derek Kaufman.
Hey everyone, and welcome once again to the podcast, where every week we try to bring a unique perspective to the week's biggest stories. I'm Jason Beckerman.
And I'm Derek Kaufman.
Remember everyone, it helps a ton if you subscribe to the podcast, download and listen to every episode, and write us a review or send an email into us at behindthebar@tmz.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how we're doing, and any ideas for future podcasts would be awesome.
Absolutely. We'd love to get the tweets and all that. We read through all of them, and we'll hopefully respond to them.
So Derek, we've been at this for a few weeks now, and we've been working here for years and years, me longer than you.
This is true.
And I think that the story maybe that has inspired the most passion, both inside the office and outside the office during my tenure here,
Kardashian family tree?
not quite as passionate, is the case of Brock Turner. Brock Turner obviously is the Stanford student athlete who was accused and later convicted of raping a young woman. The story has obviously gained national attention, not so much for the rape itself, as awful as that was, but unfortunately campus rapes are not don't happen that infrequently. But really what's happened since, the conviction and then the sentence that was 6 months, he subsequently got out in just 3 months after being convicted. And then most recently, in the last few days, a Stanford University law professor has come forward and has called for the judge to be recalled, actually, that sentenced him to the 6 months in prison.
Pulled off the bench, right?
Pulled off the bench altogether. Which is something that doesn't happen very often, to say the least, and for good reasons. I know we'll get into that. But with all that, as you and I were looking into this story and thinking about this podcast, I think what struck me the most is how much misinformation is out there, both about the underlying crime that was committed, and I think we both agree there was a crime committed, both about the underlying crime that was committed and also what's happened since the sentencing and the calling for the recusal of the judge is really based on a lot of misinformation. I think we should dig into that.
I think that's right. Yeah, this story sort of, remember the genesis of it, it was the victim's impact statement. She said in court and described in lurid detail what happened to her. She woke up with pine needles in her hair and so forth. And this spawned the whole controversy and the whole story. But we got to take a step back and learn what actually happened. What evidence were the jurors looking at? What evidence was the judge looking at? So a little timeline to give us a little structure as to what actually happened.
Because just to interrupt you, the story that I think came out that most people heard was simply that this guy was seen by two bicyclists coming by, raping her, digitally raping her up against a dumpster. And that was pretty much all I knew about the story, frankly, until more recently, once I started looking into the case about what actually happened from the beginning, from their meeting in the part wherever the party was, until they went outside.
That's the same thing I heard. You hear the Swedish bicyclist come upon him, and he's forcing himself upon an unconscious person, and then the media picks up these tidbits, but we're getting dribs and drabs. So let's take a step back and look at the timeline. So in January 2015, a Stanford swimmer, Brock Turner, allegedly sexually assaulted this unconscious and very intoxicated 22-year-old woman outside of a Kappa Alpha fraternity house. So she's at a Stanford party. The allegations are that he was digitally penetrating her with his fingers near a dumpster outside, and the two Swedish students come upon him. But what we really have here are two people. The only two people who would know what happened in that moment were Brock Turner and the victim. So we looked back at the police statements to see what were their stories, right? That's what you really need to know as to determine whether a crime was committed and how harshly it should be punished.
And just so we know that the police came upon the scene relatively quickly. The two bicyclists who had come by had actually subdued Brock Turner, taken him aside and held him down. Police were then called, and they came and they took statements from a bunch of witnesses on the scene, as well as Brock Turner himself, and then from the girl, from the at the time alleged victim nearby, later on at the hospital. Is that right?
Exactly. Okay. So we look at the old police report and saw what Brock Turner said happened, because in the moment of the incident, there's only the two of them. The Swedish guys come upon it later, and they have their own story to tell. But Brock Turner says he was at a frat party. He was hooking up with a few girls. He found one that had dark hair, shorter than him at some point. They were drinking some beer near the rear of the fraternity house. What he says is they actually started to kiss. And, it takes two to tango. So he's saying he's kissing a girl who's kissing him back. They're making out. Eventually, they leave, and they walk away from the house. And what he says is they were holding hands. He follows her to a location outside of the house. They're on the ground kissing. He says he removes her underwear and begins to digitally penetrate her. He says that during this, she's rubbing his back with both hands while he's kissing and doing other things with her sexually. He said the whole thing takes place within about 5 minutes. He never has his penis out. during any point of this, and the Swedish guys on the bicycles come by and intervene.
That's
Brock Turner's
And he
story.
acknowledges also that he is hammered at the time, right? I think I read somewhere that he had 5 beers and then some fireball shots and then some more beers after that.
That's exactly right. He had some fireball shots, the cinnamon-type liqueur or whatever it is. So he was also feeling it, but he also says in his report that he was making conscious decisions. He was hazy, but he was making conscious decisions. Is what Brock Turner says.
Important stuff. Go ahead.
But yes, he was intoxicated as well. Then they talk to they talk to the victim, the alleged victim at the time, and they say, what happened here? And what she says is pretty interesting. She says that she drank 4 shots of whiskey at home around 10 or 10:30. Then she goes to a Stanford party. She gets in a car and she goes to the Kappa Alpha fraternity where she continues to drink. And then she has 2 shots worth of vodka. She's getting increasingly inebriated. That's when that's when this sort of black hole of her story starts to happen, because she says to the cops,
just so the folks who aren't watching on YouTube
Sure.
and are listening in know, Derek actually has the police report in front of him and he's reading. I think you're going to read this next part verbatim.
That's
and this
right.
is the key to everything that happens.
That's exactly right. I've given you a summary of this, but I think it's important to listen to the words here because this is the report, and I think it's the key part. So, victim does not remember kissing anyone or walking away from the house with anyone other than the time she went to the bathroom with her sister. So she shows up to the party with her sister. Victim did not consent to any sexual activity or touching. Victim was completely unresponsive and did not wake up until she was at the Valley Medical Center. So that's what we have. She says in 2 sentences she doesn't remember kissing anyone or walking away, but then in the very next sentence she says she didn't consent to any sexual activity.
I got to tell you, Derek read this to me earlier on when we were preparing, and I'm struck by this. And I don't want, just jumping to the end, what happens at the end of this where these guys come across and Brock Turner is digitally penetrating her.
And she's unconscious.
Unquestionably constitutes a rape. But I think it's important to really analyze her statement here and just as a broad sort of philosophical point. So she says at the one hand that she has no recollection of walking away with anyone, but she insists that she did not consent to any sort of sexual contact. But everybody knows, it's unquestionably true, that she did walk away with Brock Turner. Whether she, he didn't drag her away from the house. She walked away with him. She may have been, it seems like she was, completely blacked out drunk. She has no recollection of it, but she walked away with him. But then she says, I never consented to sexual contact with anyone. And I guess, with all sympathy.
You're troubled. This seems inconsistent.
It seems inconsistent. How does she know that she didn't consent? And I guess I'm struck by that. Again, with all sympathy intact, how does she know?
I think it's a fascinating question. You're asking us sort of metaphysically, how can you say what happened during a period that you don't remember anything?
That's
when
right.
She has said, I don't remember anything, so how can you say with certainty whether you consented or not? I would push back and say, it is troubling. It's hard to know what you did during that blackout period where you say you have no memory. However, I would say, how could you have possibly, during a period where you've blacked out your memory entirely, how could you have consented during that period? Now, I don't know with certainty whether she uttered some things to Brock that seemed like consent, but is it possible, Jason, for someone to consent when they are that intoxicated that they're about to black out?
Yeah, the answer, I think, to your question is no, you couldn't have consented. But here's, anytime anybody is convicted of any crime, it is the burden of proof, as we all know, is on the prosecution to prove every element of that crime.
Beyond a reasonable
doubt.
Big burden.
Right. It's a huge burden, and for good reason. I'm not going to bore you with that. You all know why that burden is in place and how important it is to our system of justice. So you have this, the prosecution needs to establish not only that she didn't consent, but that Brock Turner, or a reasonable person in Brock Turner's situation, would have known he didn't have consent. And here's what I'm talking about. Let's say that 2 people, it doesn't have to be these 2 people, go and she and a woman, or let's say a man, indicates his consent in ways other than a verbal yes, which happens all the time. And I don't want to be sort of Pollyannish about this.
Perhaps back rubbing?
Perhaps back rubbing.
There's rarely an awkward conversation where you say, hey, can I digitally penetrate you? That doesn't happen all that often.
That doesn't happen, although there are many people on sort of, many people on different ends of the political spectrum, or maybe one end of the political spectrum, that think it always should happen, that you can't establish pure consent unless you have a verbal conversation about it. And that doesn't seem to happen here. And Brock Turner doesn't even suggest it happen. I think he was suggesting more that her body language and her reception to his kissing her was consent enough.
And one point I didn't even read, he said it seemed that she was enjoying it.
Right.
At some point during his statement to the cops, she said he was doing all these things and she seemed to be into it. it.
Right. And now,
we all pick up on these cues. You're right. It's not that much verbal when you're hooking up sometimes.
Right. And if a reasonable person in his position suggests that he did believe she was giving him consent, prosecution has to overcome that burden in the first instance. Now, again, I don't want
to say that he did this with a guilty mind. We say
that's
right.
A mens rea, as they say in the Latin in the law. Lawyers protect some Latinism so that nobody else can do the job that lawyers do.
And this makes sense, Jason, because otherwise it's going to be what we call strict liability, like statutory rape, where it doesn't matter what you were thinking. If she is under the age identified in the law, that's a crime, period, regardless whether you thought you were committing a crime.
Right. And then again, we fast forward, and she is now unconscious next to the dumpster. The bicyclists come upon them. She is literally unconscious. And at that point, even if she had consented to sex up until that point, or consented to anything up until that point, the moment you pass out, that consent is withdrawn by the law and by just human nature and humanity.
You need the consent throughout the sexual experience.
Right.
Basically. It can be withdrawn at any time. Women can say stop. Even while you're having sex, they can say get off me. And you have to stop.
Right.
You need the consent the entire time. So when she's unconscious, she can't give consent. It's over.
So now we have this.
So that's a cleaner case, right? The unconscious part, I don't think you and I have a difference of opinion that much. If someone is unconscious, you are not allowed to have sex with them. You are committing a crime if you do.
And now we fast forward to the judge. So all this is presented to the jury. The jury finds him guilty, not of the most serious charges of. Oh, the prosecution, I think, did not bring the most serious rape charges.
That's right. There were originally many charges against him, but it all distilled down into 3 offenses that he committed. And the 3 were, they were 3 felonies. They're serious. One was assault with intent to commit rape of an intoxicated person. The second was sexual penetration of an intoxicated person, and the third was sexual penetration of an unconscious person.
Right. We don't have to
I
get
think
into
the third we know.
Yeah, and we don't have to get into the distinctions in those and rape, but he was convicted.
But intoxication and unconsciousness, we do have to.
Right. But he was convicted of these very serious crimes, and the judge comes along, and under California's law, he has the judge, in this case a man, has the right to sentence him to a length of time that he sees fit, taking into account a number of factors, including the probation officer's report.
Yeah, I believe the probation officer's report recommended, given in light of the circumstances, he said 6 to 12 months is enough to satisfy all of the sort of goals that we have in punishing Brock Turner. He's young, he didn't have a prior criminal record. He said 6 to 12 months should sufficiently punish him.
The prosecution, I believe, was seeking 6 years for the crime that could have. There was a 12-year sentence possible. Prosecution was suggesting 6 years. The probation report comes and says 6 to 12 months. The judge comes down,
gives him the lower end of the probation department's recommendation, and goes with 6 months, which was the lowest of the end, but still within the range. He didn't go off and say 3 months. Gave him 6 months.
Right, and this is
registry as a sex offender. So there's things in his life that probation afterwards, and so forth.
And this is where the poop hits the fan, right? This
really
is where outrage comes from all quarters, and for good reason. I think most of us would agree. He doesn't even go to prison, by the way. He goes to the county jail. And there is an enormous distinction between the kind of life you're going to live in your local county prison, jail, versus your state prison.
I think that's, I mean, jail is a place where people are held pending trial. It's shorter term offenses. You don't have the hardened felons like the murderers, and the people convicted of serious offenses are doing time in prison. Jail, it's a mixed bag. You can have just some drunk tank kind of people.
You have a lot of misdemeanors. You have you have simple robbery, simple theft. You have lesser crimes. Those are the kind of people that are housed in jails.
Typically up to a year, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right.
So just much less serious type of a situation that you're in. It's not as hard a time. Right?
So the world comes down on this judge,
and he comes out after 3 months, right? We mentioned that.
Yeah. Well, in California, because of prison overcrowding, most people serve at a maximum 50% of their sentence. He only served 3 months. Last week, he gets out of jail.
So he walks in 90 days.
Right. And so what's the reaction of the legal community, and in particular one Stanford law professor, to this?
Massive outcry. So everyone is calling for the judge's head. I mean, right in the wake of this, at the sentencing, they called for his head, but this really reminded everyone. When they see the kid walk 3 months later, it's again, people are outraged. Right. And they start collecting signatures. So one Stanford professor, this woman, Michelle Dauber, who's a sociologist / legal professor, she's leading the charge. She wants to recall Judge Persky. The judge's name is Judge Aaron Persky. She says the leniency of this sentence and basically his other track record. She thinks he too harshly sentences certain
types of
criminals,
yes.
And this was a white privileged kid who got a very lenient sentence, and she says he has no business on the bench, and she's calling for his recall, which is a process in California where you can collect some signatures and you can call it to a vote. We have recalls here, right, Jason?
We do have recalls.
We have them for other officials.
We have them for other officials. We have Governor Gray Davis was recalled in California about 10, 12 years ago, gave rise to Arnold Schwarzenegger. When I was
we also had Gary Coleman on that ballot. You remember that?
Yes.
And Mary Carey.
That's right.
A lot of
and when I was a young kid, we had a Supreme Court justice, the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, a woman by the name of Rose Byrd, who was criticized widely for her opposition both to the death penalty and her poor administrative skills, and she was recalled in the vote of the electorate. So it does happen in California, but it is incredibly infrequent that this kind of thing happens.
It's very rare, and it should be. So 19 states have a process where they can recall officials plus D.C., but only 8 states actually allow for the recall of judges. So that's how rare it is. It's an incredible sanction to pull someone off the bench. And what do they usually do it for, Jason? Do they do it for making a decision about a case?
No, it's usually done for things like accepting bribes or acting in some sort of illegal fashion. It is not typically done in this kind of a situation, and for good reason. Derek and I have been debating these issues around Brock Turner for weeks now, but one thing we are in absolute accord on is that it is I would say it is irresponsible of this Stanford law professor to seek the removal of this judge based on what she perceives to be a bad decision. You have to understand the importance of the
independence of the judiciary.
Independence of the judiciary to our system of justice. Because let me tell you, if judges are fearful that if they come down in favor of a defendant, and that's typically the way it's going to work, they come down in favor of a defendant, that they are going to be recused from the bench. We are going to have judges acting in a way to preserve their own skin and not following the letter of the law, not following the Constitution. This judge, for whatever reason, you can criticize him, and he should be criticized. They are public officials just like any other government official, and they should be criticized for his opinion. But that doesn't mean you remove him from office, because the next time some kid comes along and is going to get a sentence that the judge feels is justified, he may, in fact, or she may, in fact, raise the sanction, raise the prison time, not because he thinks it's right or she thinks it's right, but because she wants to protect her own
That's
skin.
right. It's like you don't want judges hearing footsteps and being nervous about the influence of the media or public outcry.
Yeah.
You want them exercising their discretion in a responsible fashion. Now, you may quibble with what he did here, but we have it set in the way that we have the judiciary, especially the federal system, right?
Yeah.
So the federal system is different than the states where you sometimes elect judges. In the federal system, a federal judge is appointed and has the protection of life tenure and a fixed salary. This is so important because it allows him or her to act freely and exercise their judgment without worry about whether Congress will cut their pay or without worry that they'll be kicked off the bench.
Yeah.
They are able to be better judges, and they're considered better on the federal system by and large.
And I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I think the most classic example is the current Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Justice Roberts, who made a very controversial decision in upholding the Obama health care law against challenges that came out a couple of years ago.
And they thought that was a betrayal.
And he went against the party that had appointed him to the bench because he truly believed that it was constitutional. If Justice Roberts was afraid that he was going to be removed from office, he may very well have come down a different way. Now, many of you politically may think, hey, we don't like this law, therefore we wish Justice Roberts would have done something else. But what we know is Justice Roberts voted to his conscience, not to what the prevailing political winds told him he should do.
That's right.
And that's always what we want, both of our politicians and our judges.
That's right. He read the Constitution, and he said in his confirmation hearings, I remember it very clearly, he said, I want to call balls and strikes. I read the Constitution, and I apply it. I interpret it. I'm not supposed to be subject to what Republican or Democratic hacks are telling me what to do. And I think he was a man of integrity in that particular case. It happens from time to time. Justice Powell famously wasn't as conservative as Nixon hoped.
Yep.
It happens
all the time.
Yep.
Derek, one quick question.
Yeah.
If you're the judge,
yes,
you're Judge Persky.
Judge Persky.
And you're confronted with this. Based on everything you know, and I think you know as much about this as almost any person who wasn't deeply involved in the case,
sure.
Where do you come out? How long
do I think
you
the
sentence him
punishment
for?
Yeah.
Is 6 months enough? I mean, and there are some mitigating factors against sentencing, right? He was dead hammered, right? And that's something that people take into account.
Yeah.
He was a kid. He had his life in front of him. He had no criminal record. He was a good student within the best universities in the country,
sure.
Right? A swimmer, and by all accounts, a good citizen until this moment. Do you think 6 months is good? A year? Up to 6 years? What do you think?
If I had gotten the recommendation from the probation department and I applied all of these factors myself, I would definitely not have sentenced him to the low end of the range. I think that was a bit light given the nature of the offense. However, would I have thrown the book at him and given him 12 years? I really wouldn't.
Well,
and
even
I
the prosecutors were seeking 6.
Yeah. Okay, so I wouldn't have gone with the 6 years either.
Yeah.
I think he is, in my personal opinion, vile and reprehensible. But as a judge, when you put that hat hat on. I'm looking at the mitigating factors. I'm looking at the aggravating circumstances. He had a clean criminal record.
Yeah.
This was a kid who was a swimmer, very decorated, had a promising future. He made a terrible, terrible mistake. I don't think that is forgivable. I think you have to give that at least a year. I might have gone a little bit up, so he would have had to go to real prison and serve some time, maybe a year and a half, so he's in a real prison system. But beyond that, I think you start to look draconian. And this kid does have a future. He's an 18-year-old kid. I think he can come out and actually start life. He's going to be on a sex offender registry for the rest of his life. I think that's a lot of punishment.
And meanwhile, of course, the response to that is, well, her life is ruined because she may never bounce back from this. And we get that.
And we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah.
We really should not lose sight of that. It was horrific, her description, being behind a dumpster with pine needles in her hair. But what about you? Because I want to turn the question back at you.
Yeah,
whether you think I'm sort of lightheaded.
I think I'm in agreement with you, and it's interesting because one of the things that really rankles you and rankles me as well, but more you, is this idea that privilege gets you allowances that a lack of privilege does not. You're a guy that had a sort of more hardscrabble upbringing than I did, and you overcame that to do all the great things you've done.
I've got such a chip on my shoulder.
And you've got such a chip on your shoulder.
I just carry it around.
Right,
both shoulders chippy.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is a kid who he grew up wealthy, and his father wrote this letter about protecting him from the world at large if he's convicted too much of a sentence.
Yes.
And the whole thing. But I think I agree with you. I think that's where you need to come down. You do hope against hope that this young woman can find some sort of peace in her life, and also that in his life will not be easy. He will always be a convicted felon.
He will always be on Google with his face right
That's
there.
right.
Every job he ever applies for, people will look up the name Brock Turner and they'll see this entire story. So the punishment isn't over for Brock now that he's out of jail. It's
I
just
don't have
not.
a damn bit of sympathy for him, I got to tell you.
I really don't. I think it's pretty reprehensible. And the other thing that happened during the sentencing, you remember her victim impact statement, which was powerful and emotional.
Vice President reacted to it.
The Vice President reacted. Everyone had an emotional response. His father also gave some statements that were just sort of spoke to the privilege and were callous. They seemed callous because there wasn't enough focus on the crime, but rather on the future and how it could detrimentally impact his son. But really, I looked at that and I said, what do you expect from the dad?
Yeah.
The dad's interests are in protecting his son. You're a parent. I mean, you wouldn't say, like, my son is a piece of garbage. You're trying to get them to go lenient.
I've thought about it. It's
hard, though.
It's easy to sit on the sideline and say, oh, too bad I'd abandoned my son. Boy, as a parent, it's impossible to abandon your kid. It really is.
It's just a hard situation. Now that I've had a kid, I don't know what I would do if she did something so reprehensible.
So typically we like to end with a little bit of levity and get right into mail time and have our funny voice say mail time.
It's hard to have levity, but do we have time for one example of a recall that didn't work?
Yeah.
Okay, so there was a recent one. Judge Nancy Wiebenstock, do you remember? She was an Orange County judge who they attempted to recall her after she granted OJ Simpson custody of his 2 kids.
Oh no, I don't remember this.
So this was sort of an unsuccessful recall bid where people were again challenging the just judgment of a judge to say OJ Simpson, he was exonerated of his crime. Yes, he faced civil liability, but you want to keep parents with their children, so OJ gets custody of his kids. And people tried to recall her unsuccessfully. That's where this gets run amok. You really want the judiciary to be independent.
Right.
And so
it would be something to recall a judge based on her granting kids back to a parent who had been acquitted of any wrongdoing whatsoever.
Right. It sort of
says we appreciate
don't trust our own judges.
We appreciate this whole judge and jury system we have, but we really think he's guilty. Therefore, keep his kids from him.
Right. It was sort of preposterous, and we'll see what happens with Persky. I think it is irresponsible of this Stanford professor to be doing what she's doing. We'll have to see how it plays out, but I think recall's harsh medicine.
What's that sound?
Sounds mail-timey, Parker.
All right, mail time. Remember to write in your questions and comments to behindthebar@tmz.com.
He's such a media. He just wants his voice heard.
When it's that velvety.
And I got to tell you, we get, for every 10 pieces of mail we get in, 3 of them say more Parker time.
I know.
And we're bristling against that.
I almost want him to say it again, just velvety. Go ahead.
First one is from Bryce. I looked up Christopher Cheney after you guys mentioned him and saw that he could have faced up to 121 years in federal prison. I have seen these up to X amount of years sentences in the news before. How do judges and jury land on their final sentencing?
So Christopher Cheney was one of these guys that was convicted in some of the hacking scandals. He had hacked, and I forget exactly whose computer system, but he had released, these sex.
Scarlett Johansson, I think.
Well, Scarlett Johansson. He had released nude photos of Scarlett Johansson on the web after hacking your computer. Awful stuff. So sentences. It's a good question. Sentences are derived in 2 ways. Number one, the legislature, meaning your Congress and the federal level or your state legislature, will have passed a sentencing guidelines that will dictate an amount of time that someone is to be sentenced for the crime they have committed. It used to be the case in California and many, many other states. We had these 3 strikes laws. If you committed 3 strikes, you had to immediately go to prison forever and ever. And we've gotten away from those. But there are sentencing guidelines, a certain range of years. And then, based on different reports from the people who have examined a defendant, an accused criminal of the crime, and based on often the jury and sometimes the judge, they will analyze all the factors. And it's very important in sentencing that all factors must be considered. You can even take evidence that is not. You can even take factors that are not necessarily supported by evidence. Just think, it's a much looser standard for accepting information in determining sentencing. And the judge or jury is supposed to weigh all of that information, apply it to the sentencing guidelines, and come to a number of years.
Yeah, what's interesting about those type of sentences too, I'll just add in what Jason said was exactly right, but 121 years, it seems like gilding the lily. I mean, the kid, I don't know how old he was. Let's say he's 30. He would have to live to be the oldest man in the world to live to 151.
Yeah.
The reason they stack these sentences is you want it to stick, right, Jason? So they'll say like 3 life sentences. You only have 1 life, but they add these up. You serve the terms consecutively because the judiciary is trying to send a message.
Yeah.
Like Bernie Madoff is not going to serve 99 years. He'll die long before then. But this is a way of socially shaming people and making sure that you show that you're tough on really bad criminals.
Right, and also it allows, in some cases, depending on the crime, for the possibility of parole. They can parole in half the time that they actually have to serve. You do it for 99 years, Bernie Madoff will be 114.
Right, and good news, 1 life sentence is gone, you serve 2 more. You know what I mean?
Right.
Those kind of things.
All right, and second one, this is our last one. It seems like every site nowadays makes you create an account and a password. What is the worst password you have ever made for a throwaway account?
Oh, this is fascinating. So someone asked, what is your password on an account that you have, which I find...
A throwaway account.
A throwaway account, which I do have those. I got an old Hotmail and all that
So
stuff.
my TMZ account, I'm not afraid to say it. I mean, it's a few thousand people are... listening. I mean, 20. What do we have? 20,000 listeners? Something
Countless.
Like countless listeners.
Legion, Jason.
Is Derek loves cats? is my password?
That's a good one.
Yeah,
that's a good one. Mine's perv. Just perv 1, 2, 3.
Well, that's what I meant by loves cats.
All right, that's it for mail time.
All right, thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. We will be back again next Thursday with another podcast if Parker is still here after this.
Yeah, we'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching. If you want more nerdy deep dives into the legal side of celebrity news, hit our subscribe button right here.
And check out our previous episodes over here.